All right, today we're going to pull back the curtain on what might be one of the most brilliant and maybe one of the most cynical legal maneuvers in all of history. We're calling it the Great Laundering.
So let's just jump right in with the central question. How do you keep stolen land when you reject the very authority that gave it to you in the first place? I mean, think about it. Imagine you're a Protestant nation, say England or the Netherlands. Your whole empire is built on land that the Pope gave you. But now you've turned around and said, the Pope has zero authority, he's illegitimate. So what does that do to your claim on all that land? This was a massive, massive crisis.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the dilemma itself. Then, the absolutely ingenious legal laundering machine they invented to solve it. We'll meet the masterminds behind the new justification, see how they managed to privatize conquest, and finally, we'll trace this unbroken thread of power right up to our own time.
All right, first up, the Protestant dilemma. And it really boils down to something simple, and for these empires, pretty terrifying: no pope, no title.
Okay, so you've got to see the contradiction here. It's just laid bare. On one side, you've got the Catholic nations, right? Spain, Portugal. Their colonial empires were built completely on the authority of papal bulls, official decrees from the Pope. But on the other side, you've got England and the Netherlands. And what did they do? They publicly, sometimes violently, rejected the Pope's authority. And yet, and this is the kicker, their claims to land all across the world, they were based on the exact same papal decrees. See the problem?
And that's the whole point, really. They were stuck in this legal black hole. They had basically just told the world that their own title deeds were forgeries. I mean, if the Pope has no real authority, then your right to be in the Americas or anywhere else is built on what? Nothing? It's built on sand. They had to figure out a way to keep the land, but get the Pope's signature off the paperwork.
Which brings us to their solution. And it was, you have to admit, pretty slick. It's a kind of legal alchemy. They decided, okay, we're going to keep the power, we're going to keep the land, we're going to keep the wealth, but we're going to swap out the justification. They built a machine to wash the title clean.
I want you to really picture this. It's like a machine. On one end, you feed in those old, dirty, blood-stained papal bulls. They're covered in the fingerprints of religious authority. Then, the machine starts to whir and churn, powered by this new thing called secular philosophy. And it just washes away all that talk about God and divine right. And then, out the other end comes this clean, crisp, modern-looking legal charter. But here's the magic trick. It grants the exact same rights, the same powers of conquest, the same rights to dispossess people, same theft, just different paperwork.
Okay, so every big operation needs its masterminds, right? And this legal heist had two key architects who provided all the intellectual firepower for this grand laundering scheme.
First up, we have a Dutch lawyer named Hugo Grotius. And his big idea was an absolute game changer. He came up with this concept of natural law. Now, he argued that some legal principles are just so fundamental, so based in pure reason, that they would exist, get this, even if there is no God. That phrase, etiam sideramus, that was the philosophical solvent they needed to completely wash the Pope out of the equation.
And you can see the switch so clearly here. Under the old papal logic, right? Power flows from God, through the Pope, down to the king, and the king gets the land. Grotius just swaps out the first two steps. Now power flows from nature, through human reason, to the king. But, and this is the important part, look at that final column. The result is exactly the same. The king gets the land. They didn't change the outcome, they just secularized the logic of domination.
Okay, so the next mastermind in our story is the English philosopher John Locke. He adds another crucial piece to this puzzle with his cultivation theory. Basically, the idea was that you only truly own land if you mix your labor with it, if you improve it. And this idea led directly to this incredibly powerful and dangerous concept, terra nullius, nobody's land.
And here's how that theory actually worked on the ground. To a European, improving the land meant one thing: fences, farms, permanent buildings, plows in the ground. But land that was used in any other way, say for hunting, for foraging, for seasonal agriculture, that wasn't seen as being owned. It was redefined as vacant, empty. So just like that, the justification for taking the land flips from the Pope gave it to us to, well, they weren't really using it anyway. It's the same outcome, but with a brand new, much more scientific-sounding excuse.
So, okay, now they've got this shiny new legal framework. It's clean, it's secular, it's perfect. But the next question is, how do you actually apply this thing on a global scale? And the answer they came up with was another stroke of genius. You privatize the conquest. Yeah, this was a totally revolutionary shift in how empires were built. Instead of government sending out these huge, expensive armies, they started to send corporations. They essentially outsourced the work of empire building. They would charter these private companies to go do the dirty work, and in exchange for a cut of the profits, they gave them powers that are just unbelievable.
I mean, just look at the list of powers given to a company like the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. We're talking about the power to wage war, to make treaties with foreign powers, to mint their own money, to impose the death penalty. They could build fortresses, establish colonies. These are not the powers of a business. These are the powers of a government, of a sovereign state. It was, quite literally, conquest with shareholders.
And this shows you that clear line of succession, that thread of power, that right to dominate and dispossess. It didn't just disappear when they got rid of the Pope. No way. It was just handed down like an inheritance. First, it goes from the Pope to the king, and then from the king to the corporation. This is the moment where the modern corporate state nexus is really born.
All right, so let's take a step back and look at the aftermath. After all this brilliant legal maneuvering, what was the actual result? What really changed here? And maybe more importantly, what stayed exactly the same?
And this is what's so crucial to get. The only thing that really changed was the justification. The excuse for domination got a modern update. So papal authority became natural law. Divine right became universal principles. But the actual structure of power, it remained identical. European supremacy, the right to dispossess people of their land, territorial conquest, wealth extraction, all of it was preserved, perfectly intact. You could say they fired the Pope, but they made damn sure they kept his loop.
And you know, this logic, it's just kept updating its own software over the centuries. The labels changed to fit the times. So what was once called savage in the 1400s, by the 1800s became uncivilized. By the 1900s, that became underdeveloped. And today it's often framed as an emerging market. The language evolves, but the underlying power dynamic, it just persists.
And please don't think for a second this is just ancient history. That legal concept, terra nullius, the one that came from John Locke's theory, that was the legal basis used to declare the entire continent of Australia uninhabited when the Europeans arrived. And an Australian court didn't officially overturn that doctrine until 1992. 1992.
And if you want to see it today, just listen closely. Listen to the language that's used by huge corporations or development banks when they're justifying these massive land acquisitions. You'll hear them say the land is not being used to its full economic potential. That phrase, that is the exact same logic that John Locke used over 300 years ago. The great laundry machine is still humming along.
And that really brings us to the final reveal here. The entire process, this whole great laundering, was a masterpiece of disguise. It was all about changing how colonial power looks to make it acceptable, to make it palatable in a new, secular, so-called enlightened age.
But here's the thing about laundering. It can only do so much. It can make something appear clean on the surface. It can change the paperwork. It can provide a brand new alibi. You can change the justification 100 times over. But what you can't do is wash out the original theft.
Now, this system worked brilliantly for European powers and their corporations. But for it to become truly, deeply embedded, it had to be imported into the legal DNA of the United States itself. And in our next explainer, we are going to look at the smoking gun, the very moment when 500 years of this long-eared papal authority was woven directly into the U.S. Constitution by the Supreme Court. You are not going to want to miss that.